The November House by Charles Wilkinson. Mr. Plant could no longer recall why he was living in a tall brick house in the district. Wherever he'd been previously must have proved in some respects unsatisfactory. Yet it was only since his arrival that his mouth had become smaller, although to be accurate, his lips were contracting. The space of the interior, as he discovered by running his tongue over his teeth and palate, remained approximately the same. In the mornings, when he peered into the mirror, his mouth resembled a pufferfish's. For a man in late middle age, his skin, especially around the cheeks, was oddly smooth, no smile lines, but then he had never been given to good humor, not even faint cordiality. Was he speaking to fewer people, so the muscles around the mouth received less exercise? At his previous address, there had been a number of people he'd been obliged to speak to, even though he disliked their company. He knew no one in the district. His conversations were limited to the briefest exchanges with the owner of the general store and a weekly argument with the imbecile who drove the delivery van for Ferryman's Wines and Spirits. Outside, a gray November sky pressed down on a row of buildings in shabby red brick, long ago converted from Victorian manufactories to residential use. Mr. Plant went over to the window. The doors and lintels in the dwellings opposite were in poor repair. Most of the roofs were flat, in keeping with an industrial past. Although the district had resisted gentrification, there was one house with a pitched roof, a Georgian fanlight, and a dressed stone facade, the only house in the street with aspirations to elegance. It must once have been the home of a manager or overseer. In spite of his ankle-length overcoat, Mr. Plant shivered. The ceilings on the ground floor were high, the glass in the sash window thin. Bare wood showed through paint on the window frames. He smiled, experimentally, at a pigeon, a flash of pain on his upper lip. When was the last time he'd spoken to anyone? 2 days ago? Or perhaps 3, he'd visited the general store, and since then? Nothing and nobody. As he moved towards the telephone, his knees cracked and popped. He fumbled the receiver with his thick woolen gloves. A number had been written on a small sheet on the table. He dialed. In the grate, there was no more than the faint orange suggestion of a flame and ash. "Plant speaking," he said. "I just want to say I haven't given up." There was a click and then silence. "I'm still committed to the project. I know I haven't made any headway on it for almost 2 months now. The fact of the matter is I can't get up the stairs. This November cold has got into my bones. When the weather is warmer, I promise I'll start work again." No reply. Yet he'd a decided sense of a process in progress at the other end of the line. Were his words being recorded? Something was tickling his upper lip. "I won't make excuses, but the pain is insufferable. It's not just in my knees, but in my hands and back as well. Even if I managed to get up the stairs, I couldn't come down again. But in the summer, I'll reach the patch of grass by the canal. I'll start once I've had some sun on my body." A streak of wetness was working its way down his chin. He took off one of his gloves and wiped his face. Blood from the crack in his upper lip. He put the receiver down and began to dab at himself with a gray handkerchief. In this cold, it will soon clot, he thought. Plant was dozing when the bell rang. For once, he had slept well on the sofa. Draping an overcoat on top of the blankets had helped. Part of the technique was not to move too much during the night, but to burrow into the cushions, imagine oneself as gone to earth. He was more or less clothed. The previous night he'd failed to undress fully. The brown van parked outside had the words, "Ferryman's Fine Wines and Spirits, established 1666, on the side, in Gothic red letters. There was no address or telephone number. A conversation would be impossible to avoid. Plant moistened his upper lip to prevent the crack reopening. He drew back 3 bolts and unlocked the front door. The same as last week, a bald, clean-shaven man wearing a tweed jacket over blue overalls. He was holding a cardboard box. "If you'll just stand aside, sir, I'll take the delivery down to the cellar if you've no need of it." "I thought I made it clear last time that you were to cancel the order, which was never made by me, as you well know." "Come on, sir, we've been through all this." "Well, let's go through it again, shall we?" The man put down the cardboard box on the front steps and rubbed his arms. "Be reasonable. It's not as if you're paying for this lot, is it? Why not let me put it in the cellar, as we agreed? After all, you don't go down there, do you, on account of your disabilities?" "I don't drink alcohol." "Find out who is sending these compulsory gifts and tell them that their generosity must stop." The man made a pantomime of taking out the delivery note as if to check the precise wording, his lips twisted in the pedantic smirk of a solicitor's clerk. "Now, strictly speaking, sir, there is no personal involvement on the part of any individual whatsoever. The deliveries come with the property, so to speak, and you, being the current leaseholder, are obligated to accept them. In short, to be brief, and to put it in as few words as I am able, sir, the delivery is to the house, and not the resident therein." "Take it away and don't come back." The man's features hardened as he glared at Plant. "What's to be delivered is to be delivered," he said. "Not here." "They've got another set." "A set of what?" "Keys, of course, to all your doors. Take it from me, sir. You'd be best off letting me in now. The other fellow wouldn't like it if he has to come out." A few minutes later, once the cardboard box was in the cellar and the van had been driven away down the street, Mr. Plant took out the business card he had insisted on being given in return for allowing the man into the house. "Ferryman and Co., purveyors of fine wines, spirits, and home-brewed ales, stouts, and corkers since 1666. Chairman, C. Ferryman, Esquire." Still no address, no number. Perhaps if he were to venture out, he would find a telephone book, but he couldn't recall seeing one of the red boxes in the area. He went over to the window. The sky was icy gray. No sign of the pigeons he sometimes glimpsed, flitting from chimney pot to chimney pot, or pecking around in the street. Perhaps they had frozen to their nests. "I'm being simple-minded," he thought. Directory inquiries. He went over to the phone. "Please put me through to Ferryman and Co." "Have you got the first line of the address?" "No, unfortunately not, but they're wine merchants. Perhaps they're listed in the business section." "That's where... here they are. Oh, I'm afraid I can't do that. I'm not allowed to disclose the number." "Why? Are they ex-directory?" "Not exactly. It's only possible to contact them if you're in another region." Dark, before 5 o'clock, and no food in the house. Mr. Plant struggled into the overcoat that he wore on top of the trench coat that he no longer took off, at least not until the height of summer. Then he put on a fur hat, purchased on a visit to the Arctic Circle many years before. His 4 scarves covered his chest and the lower half of his face. Having unbolted the front door, he winced as he went down 3 stone steps and into the street. It'll be easier now you're on the flat, he thought, yet still the pain flared with every pace. His knees cracked, antiphonally. A sudden drop in temperature had powdered the pavement with frost. As always, there were no lights on in the overseer's house. Perhaps it had been ripped apart inside, the period fireplaces and even the decorative plasterwork long since removed. The place now too dilapidated for a squat, only the elegant proportions of the facade hinted at a lost authority. The bow windows of the bag of nails were illuminated by a brassy, hospitable glow. Mr. Plant caught a glimpse of wooden paneling, the chestnut patina of a leather sofa, a copper warming pan on a wall. Even the counter had a curious sparkle, although there was only one customer, who stood at the head of the horseshoe-shaped bar, where a hatch might once have been when the pub was divided, the lounge on the left, the right-hand side with the bare floor covered in sawdust. In spite of the cold, Mr. Plant stopped to watch. The solitary drinker raised his gleaming amber pint to his lips at exact intervals, appearing to drink the same quantity each time. Apart from the mechanical regularity with which he drank, he was quite still. His left hand, flat and unmoving, supported him as he leant forward on the bar. He'd gray hair, yellow over the ears. There was a faint patch of gold on one of his splayed fingers, a signet ring. The barman refilling his pint was young, with a smooth face and a pear-shaped body surmounted by a tiny head, slightly wider at the bottom than at the top of his prematurely balding head. He had a smooth forehead and a slick black widow's peak. Mr. Plant had never passed the pub without seeing the two men, although at no point had there been the slightest indication of a conversation, or even any sign of money being exchanged. It was as though they were stuck in something close to a tableau, where only a few repetitive movements were permitted. Just as he was about to move, Mr. Plant noticed, for the first time, the name of the brewer on the sign over the door. Ferryman's Fine Ales and Stouts. The general store was on a corner at the end of the street, a narrow shop with a tall ceiling. It was inadequately lit, its many shelves so packed with produce that Mr. Plant frequently found it necessary to ask for assistance. A bell rang, and the Asian man who ran it emerged from a gloomy recess at the back. "Evening, boss." Mr. Plant placed his order and watched as his small bag was stacked with essentials. He never ordered too much. He'd grown weaker, and his hands were gnarled and inflamed, just capable of grasping the handle. "Tell me, you don't happen to know the name of the man who was always drinking in the bag of nails?" "Nah, don't go in there, boss. I don't drink alcohol, me." "But you must have seen him, surely." "Yeah, always there, ain't he? But like I say, I never met the man. Different circles, know what I mean?" "Even so, you must have heard something. He has to be famous in the district." "In the bag of nails, perhaps. But I don't ask no questions about what goes on in that place, boss." "But some of your customers must have mentioned him." The Asian man glanced around his store. Apart from Plant, there was no one present. He leant forward, lowering his voice as he spoke. "They say he's the sort of bloke who knows everything. Always got a story to tell. Doesn't like to be interrupted, if you know what I mean. After a while, all the locals stopped coming in." "I'm surprised the landlord didn't bar him." "They say the man's a ferryman. Family member, know what I mean? Anyway, the landlord's not bothered, on account of his disability." The shop bell rang, and the Asian man moved away to serve two new customers. What disability? Plant wondered as he left the shop. The barman did have a strangely shaped head. Was he also the landlord? At breakfast, Mr. Plant had to slice his toast into small sections. His mouth had narrowed to an aperture less than a third of its normal width. That this condition was a medical one and not simply a byproduct of natural taciturnity now seemed apparent. Even though he'd spent an hour on mouth exercises the previous night, the benefits were short-lived. At first, when he'd woken up, he thought the lower half of his face had sealed over. It took him some time to work his way back inside with his little finger. Although towards the end of the meal, he'd managed to extend his mouth sufficiently to pop in a small sausage, his lips then snapped back into place like a rubber band. He was not registered with a doctor in the district. Indeed, now that he considered it, he was certain he had not sought medical assistance of any kind for many years. The skin that covered part of his mouth was not especially thick. Was remedial action with a kitchen knife the way forward? It would be foolish to risk infection from an open wound. He recalled that cotton wool, bandages, and antiseptic creams were in a cabinet on the second floor. If he somehow managed to get upstairs, he would also be able to spend time on his project. An ascent would be painful and time-consuming, but now he had two reasons for making it. Not long after he had managed to drag himself up the first 4 steps, the bell rang. He had forgotten it was delivery day. It had taken him almost 20 minutes to limp and crawl as far as he had up the staircase. Surrendering his hard-won position to take a delivery that he'd neither ordered nor needed was out of the question. The bell rang again, 5 times in sharp succession. The noise drove him 1 step higher. "Open up!" a voice, immediately recognizable as that of the bald man, screamed. "I can hear you shuffling about in there." Plant lowered himself carefully. He would simply keep quiet for a minute or two. No doubt the fool would give up and go away. A furious rattling of the handle. The sound of first a closed and then an open hand hammering on the door. "A delivery from Ferryman and Co. to be made to this house today. Face the consequences." And now a finger was pressed down hard on the bell. The other hand thudded on the door as if to break it down. Would the bolts hold? "Go away!" Plant screamed. "Kindly tell your superiors that I will not accept any further deliveries." "Unlock the door, then we can discuss this." "No deliveries. Not today, nor on any other day." "The decision's not yours to make, not rightly." "I've nothing further to add." "Do you want him to come round, then? I can't believe that." "I've no idea who he is. Stop issuing barely intelligible threats and go about your business." "He may not come today or even tomorrow, but he'll be here by the end of the week, at the very latest." Footsteps. The sound of the van being driven away. Gratitude brought him to his feet. Then he registered the full extent of the pain, the molten lava rising beneath the kneecaps and searing down his left leg. He forced himself up 4 more stairs. There was every chance of reaching the landing within the next half hour. When he'd last visited it, his studio had been filled with early August gold. Perhaps viewing what he'd done in winter light would suggest a way forward. He might even make a few alterations, but there was no source of heat in the house, apart from the gas ring and the fire on the ground floor. Already he could feel the swelling in his finger joints. It would be foolish to risk making a mistake when his hands were in such poor condition. He reached the bathroom. The mirror was well positioned, and he could examine his mouth. A membrane formed of pale whitish skin, strengthened with gristle, covered the left side. His lips on the right appeared narrower than he recalled. The corner of the mouth was latticed with flesh. A quick examination of the medicine cabinet revealed he was correct in assuming he'd find cotton wool and antiseptics, but he'd forgotten to bring the kitchen knife. He found a pair of nail scissors and tried to make a few adjustments to the place where the skin was least well established. Even the thinnest strand had a rubbery resilience. When tested, the blades proved blunt. He made his way down the corridor and into the studio. His project, a structure of stone and metal that he came to refer to as the Built Companion, stood on a plinth in the middle of the room. The bodywork was predominantly steel, the head marble. The features of the upper half of the face were refined and delicate, suggesting a beauty of mind as well as form. The lower half of the head consisted of jagged stone, chipped and chiseled until there was no longer sufficient material to create a convincing jawline. He recalled how he had been unable to create a pair of lips that he'd wished to kiss. For the first time, he understood he'd ruined the marble. Only by ordering another block would he be able to complete the Built Companion. Involuntarily, he put a hand to his mouth, and at once a silent question came to him with an almost audible force. If you can no longer kiss, why eat? Plant spent the night in his bedroom, his first there for many months. No matter how many blankets he'd piled up, he'd been unable to keep out the cold. As soon as he felt strong enough, he would make the descent. But as he was upstairs, there were a few things he must do. Once in the bathroom, he took out cotton wool, plasters, and a tube of antiseptic cream, all of which he put into a pocket of his inner overcoat. He went into the landing, picked up a receiver, and pressed the key for the answer phone. "You have 3 messages." He pressed a button. "I won't make any excuse," said his own voice, "but the pain is insufferable." He put back the receiver, then picked it up and dialed the downstairs phone. It was inconceivable that anyone should be at the other end. After the first 3 or 4 rings, a click as it switched to the answer phone. His own voice. "I'm sorry I can't take your message at the moment, but if you'd like to..." And then what was impossible, and in a voice that he'd never heard before, "Every device in this house, when considered according to the long-established bylaws of the district, is the property of Ferryman and Co. It has come to our attention that you were unwilling to accept this week's consignment. Expect it to arrive by the weekend. What is to be delivered will be delivered." He found a pair of black mittens in a drawer and put them on. Never had the house been so glacial. From the sash window, the sky had an ice cube, gray-white sheen. His feet on the staircase were strangely silent, as if the wood was too cold to creak. As he edged downwards, his breath unfolded in smoky bouquets. It was almost half an hour before he reached the sitting room. He put an old newspaper and the last of the kindling in the grate. The matches were in the pocket of his inner overcoat. At the 3rd attempt, he lit the fire. It was 3:30 before he remembered he hadn't eaten all day. He went to the fridge, nothing there or in even a cupboard where he kept the bread and cereals. How could he have gone through his provisions so quickly? Perhaps someone had crept in whilst he was upstairs. A second search was unsuccessful. He'd been certain he had a can of beans a little past its sell-by date, but where? He must have thrown it out. There was no choice. He'd have to go outside. With difficulty, he managed to squeeze some leather gloves over his mittens. He adjusted his scarves and opened the front door. Outside, winter had transfixed a wash of gray-black cloud to a flaking slate sky. The street and pavement slabs had been wind-scrubbed to a tinny gleam. Only a single brown leaf, abraded with pale gold, reminded him that he had once lived with trees, witnessed the change of seasons, the light turning the shadows on wide lawns, all long before he'd become trapped in what seemed like a perpetual November. The general store was closed. Was it the weekend? There were corrugated metal shutters over the windows, and a dark blue door, which he could not recall seeing previously, was not only shut, but padlocked. There was no notice or any hint of an explanation. He had never known the general store to shut. Now that he'd thought the matter through, he was certain it was always open at weekends. No doubt there was an explanation. Illness or a death in the family? But where else in the district could he find something to eat? The bag of nails? They must serve some food, a plowman's lunch, or crisps at the very least. A van, with the familiar ferryman's logo on the side, drew up beside him. The delivery man, who was in the driver's seat, wound down the window. As the man leant forward to speak, Plant caught a glimpse of his companion in the passenger seat, an enormous, shaven block of a head. The nose had been replaced by what looked like an axe blade. The pale, not quite human eyes studying Plant might have been borrowed from a species that could spot its prey from a distance of a mile or more. "Ah," said the driver, "you're out. Probably just as well, because we'll soon be going inside your house. I wouldn't hurry back. My friend here likes to have a look around when he makes a home delivery. See if there's anything that needs altering." Even after the van was driven away, Plant remained quite still, as if he'd encountered a creature capable of immobilizing its quarry. It started to rain, thick lines of freezing iron. Already his outer overcoat was heavy. He must make a move. The lights of the bag of nails were on, ambiguously welcoming, as though ready to offer only a sticky yellow solace, a taste of egg yolk and various poisons. A bell rang as he opened the door. Immediately, the strong scent of bygone tobacco and something almost sulphurous. The barman was drawing a pint of deep gold, browned beer. It frothed in the sleeve before settling. He set it on the counter, where it gleamed and effervesced, and then glanced at Plant. "What are you having, a drink or a story?" said the barman. He switched on an overhead lamp. The black bar gleamed with points of light, as if whole galaxies had just been made visible. After a moment, Plant understood that hundreds and hundreds of nails had been driven into the wood. "Neither. I'd like something to eat. Do you have a menu?" Without moving his body apart from his head, the man at the bar turned towards Plant. His mouth was huge, crocodilian, the eyes heavily lidded, the skin rough and patched with red sores and nests of burst capillaries. "Food is only served with drink in this house," he said. "What are you having?" He spoke in a deep, upper-class boom that seemed inauthentic, not so much the product of upbringing as training, the voice of a would-be theatrical knight. "That's very civil of you, I'm sure, but I don't take alcohol." "Good God!" roared the man. "A chap in the bag of nails, and he doesn't bloody well drink. Well, that's a first, isn't it, landlord?" "Mr. Ferryman's right, sir," said the barman, not meeting Plant's eye. "The license is very specific on the matter. Food is only to be served with alcohol." Plant ran his eye along the shelves. Beneath the optics, there was a row of miniatures. "Well, in that case, I'll have one of those little bottles of whiskey to take out." "That's the spirit." The barman leaned forward. He seemed to be staring at what remained of Plant's mouth. "I'm sorry, sir. If you could repeat that." "The fellow's deaf," bellowed Mr. Ferryman. "Shame, really. He's missed out on some bloody fine stories." Then Plant saw Mr. Ferryman's left hand, the fingers splayed and rigid, the palm flat against the counter, and nailed to it. Nearby were black rivulets of blood that had dried, who knows how long ago. "Useful in its way," said Mr. Ferryman, following his gaze, "and a bloody sight easier than rowing. Anyway, a gentleman should never fall down just because he's been drinking." The barman placed the miniature and a tumbler opposite Mr. Plant. "To drink in, sir, if you'd be so good." "Now, may I see the menu?" He moved what was left of his mouth slowly. His voice was low and weak, coming from deep within him. The barman pointed to a glass jar. An elliptical yellow moon swam in viscous brown liquid. "A pickled egg?" "Have you got anything else?" The barman nodded and moved away, no doubt to fetch something from the back. "I can tell you a story or two about pickled eggs, but perhaps I'd best say a little bit about the pickling process first." Without warning, Mr. Plant's left hand was being held down firmly. He turned round in time to see the first strike of the hammer, the blood jetting, the nail half driven through the flesh. Then the barman gave it one more tremendous blow, and a couple of neat taps, a final touch of artistry. Mr. Plant attempted to cry out. His skin convulsed and thickened, as if to defend veins and arteries beneath its surface. His long howl of pain died away, locked inside him. "Good Lord," said Mr. Ferryman, surprise overcoming his anger at the interruption. "Your mouth is completely sealed over." His eyes were bright with anticipation and excitement. How many millions of years was it since he'd last had such a ready audience, a companion captive to the finest touch of his every tale?